For the inhabitants of Oahu, there was nothing unusual in being jerked out of sleep by guns and bombs and low-flying aircraft. The island was crowded with military bases, and live firing drills were commonplace. In early 1941, as the danger of war had seemed to grow, the services took to conducting simulated combat exercises, mock battles pitting the Army against the Navy against the Marines against the Army. On these days, a colossal amount of ammunition was thrown up into the air, and the island's lightly built wood frame houses would shake and rattle as if an earthquake had struck. So when the familiar racket started up, at a little before 8 in the morning on that first Sunday in December 1941, most of the residents pulled a pillow over their heads, or turned back to their coffee and comic strips and radio programs, and tried to ignore the deep concussive thuds of distant bombs, the heavy booming of anti-aircraft batteries, and the faint rat-a-tat-tat of machine guns. But it was soon clear that these were no ordinary exercises. Floors shook, windows rattled, airplanes roared low overhead, and empty machine gun casings fell on rooftops like hail. In Honolulu, civilians emerged from their homes, many still wearing pajamas and nightshirts. Explosions could be heard in the city, and smoke rose above King Street in the McCully district. Sirens blared, and to the west, above Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field, a gigantic pall of oily black smoke boiled thousands of feet into the sky. Looking up, observers on the ground could see a small armada of dive bombers circling at high altitude in lazy figure-8 patterns. Every so often, a group of the aircraft would coalesce into an orderly attack formation, and then individual planes would peel off, one by one, to begin their dive bombing runs. The spectators were impressed. The flyboys were putting on a terrific show. 12-year-old Dan Kong, still in his pajamas, remarked to his brother, "Wow, spectacular maneuvers." The two climbed an avocado tree in their family's backyard for a better view. "I had to admit it was very realistic," another civilian witness recalled. A sailor at Pearl Harbor pronounced it the best goddamn drill the Army Air Force has ever put on. The heavy smoke over Pearl Harbor was thought to be smoke bombs, or perhaps, as Honolulu Mayor Lester Petrie supposed, a practice smokescreen. "I thought that was a perfect demonstration." At 8:04, KGMB interrupted its regular Sunday morning radio broadcast of organ music carried live from the First Baptist Church of Waikiki. The announcer, Webley Edwards, read a brief statement recalling all military personnel to their bases and stations. Normal programming then resumed, but new interruptions followed every few minutes, with announcements calling firemen, doctors, rescue workers, and disaster wardens to work. At 8:40 a.m., Edwards came back on the air. "We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important news. Please pay attention. The island is under attack. I repeat, the island is under attack by hostile forces." Skeptical listeners refused to take the news seriously, assuming that the announcement was another element of an unusually vivid practice alert. Some recalled the panic caused by Orson Welles' fictional War of the Worlds broadcast 3 years earlier. Shortly before 9, Edwards returned to the air. In a quavering voice he pleaded with his listeners to believe him. "Japanese forces are attacking the island. This is the real McCoy." Even seasoned military men found it difficult to believe what they were seeing, and admitted to feeling bewildered and disorientated as the attack unfolded. The notion that an actual raid was underway was slow to enter their minds. In the eyewitness accounts, that pattern of belated at the intruder. "What a stupid, careless pilot, not to have secured his releasing gear. It explodes. Somebody goofed big this time. They loaded live bombs on those planes by mistake." As the plane turns upward, the Japanese rising sun insignia comes into view on the underside of the wings. They were really going all out. They have even painted the rising sun on that plane. An American ship explodes. What kind of a drill is this? Even then, some men refused to believe that a war had begun that morning, perhaps, as Commander A.L. Seaton of the light cruiser Street Lewis first guessed, the attacker was a lone, berserk Japanese pilot who somehow had gotten to Pearl and now would be in trouble with his Navy and ours. On the street outside the YMCA in downtown Honolulu, sailors were piling into buses, jitneys, taxicabs, and private cars. Military trucks roared down the main thoroughfares, crammed with armed soldiers wearing tin helmets, looking skyward. Fire trucks, rescue units, and policemen on motorcycles raced toward the fires burning in several parts of the city. Sirens screamed. Rubber shrieked on pavement. No one observed the speed limits. On the 2-lane blacktop highway to Pearl Harbor, recalled Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage, every conceivable vehicle was loaded with sailors' buses, taxis, and everything else rushing to get out there. For many witnesses, the first direct confirmation that an actual attack was underway came as their vehicles were strafed by low-flying enemy planes. "We heard what sounded like the clicking of typewriter keys," said Seaman Larry Katz, who was sharing a cab with several other sailors. "I looked out the back window and saw a plane coming down the highway with fire coming out of its wings or engine. It was tracer bullets coming down the highway at all the cars, including ours." Jack Lower, a civilian electrician, was riding with several other men in the back of an open truck. Each time a plane approached for a strafing run, the men pounded their fists on the roof of the cab, the driver stomped on the brakes, and the passengers dove into the roadside foliage for cover. As the aircraft passed, they clambered back into the truck and continued. Navy Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson recalled seeing sparks leap up from the pavement just ahead of the car in which he was riding as a passenger. Moments later, the car ahead was hit with a burst of 20mm cannon. Suddenly, from the shock of bullets, that sedan rocked and was enveloped in a cloud of yellow dust, he wrote. "We watched the car careening and bumping crazily on empty tires. I had time to register an impression of small holes of raindrop size along that car, like stitches." By 8:10 a.m., just 15 minutes after the first bombs and torpedoes had struck the ships lying in Pearl Harbor, the main battle force of the Pacific Fleet was crippled. Along the eastern shore of Ford Island, in the anchorage known as Battleship Row, the battleships lay smashed, burning, and blackened, their masts and superstructures leaning over the harbor at 45-degree angles. So much thick black smoke was billowing out of the stricken ships that observers could barely tell which had been hit. The California was half sunk, her keel resting on the bottom, her hull ripped open by Japanese torpedoes. The West Virginia was smashed and blazing, her paint charred and bubbling, with enormous volumes of smoke pouring from her stricken port side. The Maryland and the Tennessee were in better shape, but both ships were jammed against the mooring dolphins, immobilized and out of action. Oklahoma, hit by a barrage of torpedoes, had actually capsized, turning 150 degrees off the vertical, her long keel pointed up toward the sky. The battleship Arizona's forward magazine had detonated in a mighty thunderclap of sound, deep and terrible, sending a ball of fire mushrooming into the sky to a height of several thousand feet. Seconds after the explosion, burning debris began raining down on the decks of nearby ships. It continued to fall for an improbably long time. There were steel fragments in the air, fire, oil, God knows what all. Seaman Martin Matthews of the Arizona recalled, pieces of timber, pieces of the boat deck, canvas, and even pieces of bodies. "I remember lots of steel and bodies coming down. I saw a thigh and leg, I saw fingers, I saw hands, I saw elbows and arms. Much of the Arizona was simply gone. The ship had been turned inside out, as it were, and the surviving portion of the hull sank to the harbor floor, leaving only a portion of the superstructure and the muzzles of 3 guns from turret 2 showing above the surface. Her tower and cranes leaned steeply toward the channel, and dead men hung upside down from the ladders. The blast had killed more than 1,000 of the Arizona's crew in an instant, and many of the survivors were so badly burned that their shipmates did not know how to help them. These men were zombies, in essence," recalled Marine Private James Corey, who served aboard the Arizona and survived the attack. "They were burned completely white. Their skin was just as white as if you had taken a bucket of whitewash and painted it white. Their hair was burned off, their eyebrows were burned off. They were moving like robots. Their arms were out, held away from their bodies, and they were stumping along the decks." But for many who witnessed the events of December 7, 1941, the most unforgettable image of all was the sight of the enemy airplanes, diving out of the sky in such numbers that the morning had seemed to dim, as if a cloud had passed across the sun. Before that morning, Americans had been led to believe that Japanese naval airpower was a joke, an assortment of second-rate airplanes piloted by third-rate aviators. But these planes were handled brilliantly. The dive bombers planted their bombs with pinpoint accuracy. The torpedo planes came in low and made textbook drops. The Zeros roared in on the tails of the bombers and made deadly strafing runs. If not for the carnage on the ground and in the harbor, The entire spectacle could have been an airshow. Witnesses were amazed at how low the attackers flew, so low as one person remarked that you could have thrown a baseball and hit a Japanese airplane, so low that witnesses on the third floor of the Navy Yard Hospital looked down on the torpedo planes as they began their runs on the American battleships. The Japanese pilots were plainly visible in their cockpits. Many with canopies open. Witnesses could see their cat's eye flight goggles, their wind-blown scarves, their brown aviators' helmets, their white headbands. Hell, I could even see the gold in their teeth, said an Army officer at Wheeler. Many witnesses recalled the strange sensation of making eye contact with an enemy pilot. Some of the Japanese smiled ruefully, almost apologetically. A few even waved. Others laughed and made taunting gestures. They were so low you could see them grinning, you know, remarked machinist's mate Leon Bennett of the Neosho. I mean, really, they were laughing. All smiles. They were having a field day, a ball. A Marine reported seeing a rear seat gunner let go the handles of his gun, clasp his hands high above his head and shake them in that greeting with which American prize fighters salute their fans. Then he grabbed his gun and shot some more. Watching the diving planes, the falling bombs, and the exploding ships, some eyewitnesses were reminded of newsreel footage of the war in Europe, or a big-budget Hollywood production. The entire scene had an unreal, dreamlike quality. I still expect to awaken from a bad dream or see the end of a war movie, wrote Captain Elfej Gendreau, a fleet surgeon, several weeks afterward. Theodore Mason, seaman of the California, agreed the entire scene had the flickering two-dimensional quality of a B-grade war film. In many cases it was the non-visual senses that left the most lasting impression on the memory: the terrified screams of the men trapped below decks, how the steel rungs of the ladders in the burning ships seared into the palms of the escaping sailors, the bitter taste of fuel oil in the mouth, the rank, cloying odor of burning flesh. The memories were jumbled, out of sequence, but they were also vivid, indelible, even after the passage of many years. The terrible suddenness of the raid, the abrupt transition from peace to war, the immense scale of the carnage, the almost incomprehensible fury and malevolence of the attackers. It was like being engulfed in a great flood, a tornado or earthquake, said Chief Petty Officer Charles Russell. The thing hit so quickly and so powerfully it left you stunned and amazed. For signalman John H. McGoran of the California, the experience of being at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was simply impossible to describe. If you did not go through it, there are no words that can adequately describe it. If you were there, then no words are necessary. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been passing a tranquil Sunday afternoon in his Oval study on the second floor of the White House. Not to be confused with the larger and more formal Oval Office, located downstairs, the study was a part of the president's official residence. A set of double doors on the west side of the room led directly to his bedroom and private bath. In past presidential administrations, the study had been known as the Yellow Room or Oval Parlor, and had been used variously as a sitting room, a library, and a place for the storage of unwanted furniture and files. President Harding had played poker here with his friends and cronies, and the Hoovers had used it as a screening room for silent films. By December 1941, Roosevelt had occupied the study for 9 years, and it had acquired a cluttered, lived-in, and slightly dingy appearance, much like his house at Hyde Park, in the Hudson River Valley of New York. Nearly every square inch of the walls was occupied with photographs and paintings of many different shapes, sizes, and themes. There were not enough bookcases to accommodate all of the president's books, so volumes were jammed horizontally above the rows on the shelves, or stacked on the floor against the walls and in the corners. Heavy drapes blocked the natural light from the windows, giving the room a gloomy aspect, but the darkness helped obscure the fraying corners of the upholstery, the threadbare patches in the carpet, and the black cords that snaked along the floor from the lamps to the wall sockets. The ashtray on the president's desk was often overflowing with spent butts, and the room smelled deeply of cigarettes. If the decor had any unifying theme at all, it was nautical. There were perhaps 24 of Roosevelt's beloved collection of Currier and Ives prints, depicting wooden sailing ships at sea. There were half a dozen ship models on the tables and bookcases, protected under glass display cases, and on one of the walls, next to a picture of the president's own mother, hung a portrait of John Paul Jones, naval hero of the American Revolution. For Roosevelt, the Oval study was a refuge of sorts, his inner sanctum. Often he spent his entire day here, seated in his wheelchair, behind his desk, his back to the large south-facing windows with their view of the ellipse and the Washington Monument. Much of the substantive work of his presidency was done at this desk. Here he read reports, dictated letters and memoranda, spoke on the telephone, and received aides and visitors. But this was also the room in which Roosevelt liked to relax, as he was doing on this particular Sunday afternoon. Dressed in an old gray turtleneck sweater and flannel slacks, he was tinkering with his stamp collection while carrying on a desultory chat about things far removed from war with his closest aide and good friend, Harry Hopkins. The two men had eaten lunch in the study, on trays. Earlier, the president had sent word that he would be unable to join First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and about 30 guests at a luncheon in the Blue Room. Eleanor would subsequently tell the disappointed visitors, a mixed group of friends, relatives, and government officials, that her husband had been detained by the crisis unfolding in the Pacific. But that was not strictly true. Roosevelt had sent his regrets before the raid had even begun. He was tired and he wanted to relax. He would have no such luck. The black telephone on his desk rang at 1:40 p.m. It was Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who advised Roosevelt that an alert had just been transmitted from Pacific Fleet Headquarters Air Raid Pearl Harbor. "This is no drill." Knox could offer no further details, but promised to call back as soon as he knew more. Hopkins was incredulous. Japan, he said, would not and could not attack Hawaii. The report must be wrong. Roosevelt did not agree. He said he believed the report was probably true, and remarked that it was just the kind of unexpected thing the Japanese would do. Within minutes, Admiral Harold R. Betty Stark, the chief of naval operations, called to confirm the appalling news. Stark and Knox had been on the phone with Rear Admiral Claude C. Block, commandant of the 14th Naval District in Hawaii, who had given them a real-time eyewitness account of the raid while the second wave of enemy planes was over the base. A few minutes later, the president took a call from Joseph B. Poindexter, the territorial governor of Hawaii, who requested and was granted authority to declare martial law in the islands. During this brief conversation, Poindexter's voice rose to a frantic pitch. The president turned to Hopkins and the other aides who had crowded into the study and exclaimed, "My God! There's another wave of Jap planes over Hawaii right this minute." The news passed quickly through the White House. Eleanor was told by one of the White House ushers just as she was seeing her luncheon party off. The visitors stood around in stupefied knots. One later wrote there was nothing to say, it was absolutely incredible. The guests seemed to melt away. Nobody bothered to say goodbye to anyone. The First Lady went upstairs and slipped into the president's study, but the room was already crowded with aides, and she soon realized that her husband was concentrating on what had to be done and would not talk about what had happened until this first strain was over. She withdrew to her sitting room and went to work on her correspondence. Throughout the afternoon, updates poured into the White House. Grace Tully, the president's chief secretary, took several calls from Admiral Stark. She made shorthand notes of what he told her, then quickly typed the information into memos and handed them to Roosevelt. The boss maintained greater outward calm than anybody else, but there was rage in his very calmness, Tully wrote. With each new message he shook his head grimly and tightened the expression of his mouth. A steady stream of aides was entering the study, and soon the din of loud voices made it impossible for her to work. She moved out to the hallway, and then to the private telephone in the president's bedroom. While she was typing, members of the staff hovered behind her and peered over her shoulder. She later wrote, "The news continued to come in, each report more terrible than the last, and I could hear the shocked unbelief in Admiral Stark's voice as he talked to me. At first the men around the president were incredulous, that changed to angry acceptance as new messages supported and amplified the previous ones." Seated behind his desk at the center of the storm, Roosevelt remained calm and composed. He spent much of the afternoon on the telephone, attending to troop movements, dictating a news release for the press, setting up new security procedures for ports and strategic installations, ordering measures to observe or detain enemy nationals. Dozens of executive orders were required. Roosevelt told his aides to execute the orders immediately, and bring them to him for a signature later. One by one, the president's leading military and foreign policy advisors arrived in the study and took a seat. Secretary Knox, Admiral Stark, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. The president asked hard questions. How could the attack have succeeded? How bad was the damage? What were the Japanese likely to do next? It was still not clear what was happening in Hawaii. The radio-telephone connection to Oahu was lost several times, cut off in mid-sentence, and at one point there was a period of several hours in which no connection could be obtained. Were the airstrikes continuing? Each new report suggested that the destruction was worse than previously believed. As the meeting adjourned, about 4:30 p.m., it was agreed that the full cabinet would be summoned to meet at the White House at 8:30 that evening, with the congressional leaders to follow at 9. Many of the people around Roosevelt judged that he was, in a sense, relieved. The waiting and uncertainty were finished. The American people had been bitterly divided over the prospect of war, but now in a way that would unite our people. Eleanor agreed. I thought that in spite of his anxiety, Franklin was in a way more serene than he had appeared in a long time. I think it was steadying to know finally that the die was cast. As the last of the Japanese aircraft headed back out to sea, the East Lock of Pearl Harbor was littered with flotsam of every description, much of it blackened by the flames. Clothing, shoes, books, life vests, mattresses, accommodation ladders, lifeboats, barrels. There was an almost indescribably foul combination of odors: the oppressive fumes of fuel oil, the vast billowing clouds of black, acrid smoke, the sickly sweet smell of charred flesh. Millions of gallons of oil had erupted into the harbor from the torpedoed battleships. People who have never seen this at sea cannot imagine what oil is like once it is exposed to cool seawater, said Private Corey. It becomes a globe-like carpet about 6 inches thick, gelatinous. Sailors who leapt from the burning ships, or were blown off the decks by explosions, found themselves swimming through congealed oil. It was exhausting and dangerous. Seaman Mason of the California tried to swim beneath the surface, but when he came up for air, the gummy black oil was clogging my nose and ears, burning under my eyelids. The rank, sweet taste of the stuff made me want to vomit. The wind was blowing hard, about 25 knots. Photographs taken that morning show flags flapping hard on their poles. Inevitably, the fires on the battleships, fanned by those powerful gusts, spread to the harbor. Survivors described a conflagration advancing toward them across the water, how it engulfed the heads of other men. The brief, agonized screams from behind the curtain of flames, and then silence. Even from a distance, the heat radiating from the vicinity of Battleship Row was almost unendurable, but motor launches and whaleboats plowed directly into the maelstrom in the attempt to rescue survivors. The crew of one boat tried to douse the fires using handheld CO2 extinguishers. The sides of the boat broke into flames, which had to be put out before the next run, said Lieutenant Ephraim P. Holmes. The heat was so intense that the men in the boat had to lean way over the unexposed side to protect themselves. Swimmers found salvation in a boathook, as they were seized by the belt or collar and hauled into a boat. These rescued men were choking on oil, spitting oil, vomiting oil. Many were so thoroughly drenched in oil that it was difficult to determine whether they had been wounded. I remember one sailor that I pulled out of the water, and I took my handkerchief and wiped the oil from his face, said Marine Private Leslie LaFan. I could not tell if he was a black man or a white man or a Chinaman. They were laid in the bottom of the boats, said Seaman Ed Johann, until each boat was loaded with the wounded, all pressed together, all in great pain. At 10:10 dock, across the harbor from Ford Island, wounded men were lifted on stretchers from the boats. The scene was chaotic. Sailors and officers who had spent the night ashore pressed forward, hoping to find a boat that could take them back to their ships. Sirens screamed. Medical corpsmen shouted to clear a way for the stretchers. Dead and wounded men were laid in rows on the concrete pier. Private cars and ambulances were arriving in great numbers, immobilizing traffic. The wounded were administered a shot of morphine and offered a drink of water. Their faces were blackened by smoke or soot, their eyes almost smashed shut. Some had lost all of their hair and much of their skin. It was necessary to strip the burned victims of their clothing, but oil-soaked fabric had seared into the flesh, and when it was removed, long ribbons of skin came off with it. I was trying to put some petroleum jelly on them and trying to cover them with gauze, said shipfitter 3rd Class Louis Grabinski of the West Virginia, who lent a hand with the wounded. But that was not helping. It seemed to be taking their skin off. It seemed like it was better to just leave the skin open instead of putting something over it. They wanted to tear the gauze off, or if they had a skivvy shirt, they wanted to tear that goddamn thing off, because they were blistered, burnt. Emergency treatment centers were set up in several locations throughout the Navy Yard and Ford Island, including the Marine Barracks, the dispensary, and the bachelor officers' quarters. All were soon overwhelmed with casualties. At the Ford Island mess hall, wounded men were laid on all of the tables, and newly arriving stretchers had to be left on the patio outside. Some of these men looked beyond help, burned flesh and bone showing through the oily mess, said Seaman Victor Camont. Some of these men were half-clothed, raw meat just hanging from their bones. Some cried like babies, babbling for their mother, father or loved ones. It was a sickening sight. Lightly wounded men were wandering around in a daze, refusing to respond when spoken to, resisting violently when others tried to lead them into the centers for treatment. There were men who were completely naked but seemed unaware of their nakedness, even in the presence of civilian women or Red Cross nurses. Carl Carlson, a sailor who was fortunate to escape from the Arizona with minor wounds, recalled meeting one of his shipmates in the sick bay at Ford Island. The man was laying across from me and he was holding his intestines in with his hands. And he looked up at me, and he said, "War sure as hell, is not it, shipmate?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." And I was not bleeding anywhere, so I got up and walked out of there. On the docks and landings, the dead were being laid in 2 rows, with a walkway down the center. The heads in each row pointed inward, so that the bodies could be identified, either by their faces or their dog tags. Some of the dead men's faces had an unnaturally dark pallor, but their bodies showed no visible wounds that indicated that they had been killed by the concussive force of one of the huge explosions, shattering the blood vessels without breaking the skin. Seaman Nick Correttas of the USS Raleigh spent several hours searching for his brother. I would run along the aisle and, knowing my brother's characteristics, look for him. He chewed his nails. I knew where he had a wart. I knew every little mark on his body. I would get so far, and I would say, well, this guy looks like him, but I could not see a face. I would pick up the hand, and I would say, no, that's not him, and then go on. Eventually, sheets or blankets were brought to cover the bodies. I will tell you one thing, said Seaman William Fomby of the Oklahoma. When you see all these people in bed sheets laying out stacked up like cordwood, it takes all the glamour out of war. You really realize that something bad is going on. The Ford Island airfield was a ghastly sculpture garden of twisted, burning clots of aluminum wreckage, the remains of aircraft wiped out on the ground. 33 out of 70 planes had been destroyed in the raid. At the southeast end of the island, Hangar 6 lay gutted and smoking. It had been struck by at least 3 Japanese bombs. On the seaplane ramp, the strafed and burning fragments of the big PBY Catalina seaplanes were scattered among the ubiquitous palm trees. Concrete surfaces throughout the island were littered with shrapnel and pocked with large craters, each marking the spot where a 550-pound bomb had landed. Sailors who had been ordered to abandon their ships were milling around in confusion, their uniforms smeared with blood and oil. There was a lot of us there in limbo, just standing around, Seaman Elmo Rash remembered. I started thinking about everything that had happened, and I started to shake. I walked around for a while until I was feeling better. Men were in various states of undress, and some plundered the abandoned barracks and dependents' housing for clothing. There were reports of men wearing bizarre get-ups, a sailor's cap and a lieutenant's dress blue jacket, a tuxedo with bare feet, a bathrobe and boots, seaman's dungarees with a swallow-tailed coat and a fore and aft admiral's hat. Gangs of sailors roamed the island, bandoliers of ammunition slung over their shoulders, like bandits in a Western film. In the Ford Island Administrative Building, said bosun's mate Howard French, there was mass confusion. There was no order, no control, no authority. People were milling around like so many lost sheep. The Marine Barracks, a massive concrete building in the Navy Yard, was hastily converted into a receiving and billeting center for these itinerant sailors. Men who had crawled out of the harbor were instructed to strip off their oil-soaked clothing and place it in garbage cans, and then stand in line for a hot shower. In many cases, the sludge oil had penetrated so deeply into the men's pores that it was nearly impossible to get clean. You wiped off as much as you could with towels and whatever rags you could find, but there was no way in the world to get it all off, said Seaman Jim Lawson of the Arizona. Soap and water did not do the trick. It was necessary to scrub the oil-stained skin with alcohol or gasoline. Some men went so far as to actually bathe in gasoline, but even those who managed to remove the visible stains complained for weeks afterward that they were coated head to foot in a thin film of oil. that their eyes smarted from the gasoline, or that they were plagued by intense headaches and blurred vision. The Marine Quartermaster Sergeant issued clean, dry dungarees, underwear, socks, a toothbrush, toothpaste, a razor, and a ditty bag to any man who needed them. Paperwork was ignored. No one was required to sign for anything. The Marine Mess Sergeant did his best to feed any hungry sailor who walked into the mess hall, and the chow line was continuous, with men lining up for lunch behind others still waiting for breakfast. It was feared that the drinking water may have been poisoned by saboteurs, so men drank beer, soft drinks, Kool-Aid, and water drawn from swimming pools. One sailor remembered that he and his mates were grateful to be served dry sandwiches and coffee made from chlorinated swimming pool water. We were hungry, so it was delicious. A check-in station for sailors was set up on the first floor of the Marine barracks. The name of each abandoned ship was stenciled on the wall behind a table staffed by a junior officer. Sailors and officers checked in and were told to wait for reassignment. Many were ordered to join cleanup details on the ships and around the base. On Ford Island, teams of sailors removed debris from the hangars and pushed wrecked aircraft off the runways. Others carried fire extinguishers and put out dozens of small brush fires that had sprung up in the grasslands around the airfield. Men were given buckets and ordered to pick up shrapnel and scrap metal. There was so much shrapnel on the ground that you could walk out on the parking lot and scoop it up with your hands. The public works staff of the 14th Naval District was hard at work laying a new 16-inch water main from Hospital Point to Ford Island, and other workers were getting the dry docks back into working order. Sailors returned to the stricken battleships with galvanized steel buckets, and began the grisly task of collecting the remains of their slain shipmates. I recall finding severed knee joints as well as shoulder fragments and torn, burning body torsos, all unidentifiable because of their burned condition, remembered Seaman Charles Seahey of the Nevada. Though the shock of the raid was still fresh in everyone's minds, the survivors made a concerted effort to raise their collective morale. Music helped on the waterfront at Ford Island. A jukebox blared "I Do Not Want to Set the World on Fire," and on the battleship Maryland, the ship's band performed on deck while the repair teams worked. The crew of the Nevada agreed on a new nickname, the Cheer Up Ship. Signs on her deck proclaimed "We will fight again" and "Cheer up the Cheer Up Ship." The crisis tended to bring out the best in the malingerers, the lazy men, even the prisoners in the brig, who were ordered out of their cells and put to work. Everyone pitched in. Things were so bad at Pearl Harbor, Seaman Mason recalled, that even the chiefs were working. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was staggered by the number of things he did not know. He did not know where the enemy aircraft had come from. He did not know where they had gone. Had they been launched from aircraft carriers? Or from Japanese airbases in the Marshall Islands, several thousand miles to the southwest? The latter seemed implausible, given the great range, but if they were carrier-borne aircraft, where had the enemy carriers gone? North, south, west? Were they running for safety, or preparing another airstrike? Above all, had the Sunday morning raid been the opening move in a planned sequence of attacks, perhaps to be followed by troop landings? Was Oahu about to be invaded? Kimmel's CINCPAC headquarters was in a 3-story white stucco building with an Art Deco facade, lined with coconut palms and fronted by a neatly kept lawn. His windows offered a panoramic view of the carnage in the harbor. The staff officers were doing what they could to pull themselves together, but the stark reality that the entire Pacific battle force had been knocked out of action had left them stunned and speechless. Kimmel seemed calm and collected, recorded Lieutenant Commander Edwin T. Layton, an intelligence officer on the CINCPAC staff. But he looked shocked by the enormity of the thing that was happening to his command and by the fact that his world was blowing up around him. As the admiral watched his precious battleships burn, he occasionally muttered, "What a doleful sight." Officers who had abandoned the stricken ships streamed into the headquarters, their white uniforms stained with fuel oil. Many seemed dazed. Although no one was willing to admit it at the time, a heavy pall of fear had settled over the headquarters. Layton recalled that his yeoman's hands shook visibly as he handed the commander an intelligence log, and Lieutenant Walter J. East stated flatly that people were frightened, and if they say they were not, they were damned liars. In those first desperate hours after the raid, Kimmel's problem was not so much that he lacked good intelligence about the enemy's whereabouts. His problem was that his headquarters staff were overwhelmed by reports that were ambiguous, contradictory, garbled, or altogether wrong. His initial instinct was that the enemy carriers had approached from the north, a squadron of U.S. Army bombers arriving that morning from the mainland had spotted Japanese planes headed north after the raid, and a radar station at Opana, on northern Oahu, had also tracked aircraft headed northward. But the Japanese raid had destroyed or immobilized most of Oahu's long-range patrol planes, both Army and Navy, so the American commanders were unable to launch a proper air search. At 9:42 a.m., Kimmel warned the U.S. carrier Enterprise, at sea about 200 miles west of Oahu, that there was some indication of a Japanese carrier force northwest of the island. Within minutes, however, new contact reports pointed south. One faulty alert put 2 Japanese carriers southwest of Barber's Point. The cruiser Minneapolis, which was near the reported coordinates, attempted to send a dispatch correcting the report. But the ship's radio operator made a transmission error, with the result that the message went out as 2 enemy carriers instead of no enemy carriers in sight. The Enterprise turned east to give chase, and launched 15 Douglas Dauntless SBD dive bombers to search the zone southwest of Oahu. 6 Curtiss SOC-3 seaplanes were launched from her accompanying cruisers to search north and northeast. Both flights found only American ships, but in some cases the pilots mistook them for enemy ships, adding new layers of confusion to the scene. The CINCPAC diary noted the view was held for some time that carriers were both north and south of the island. On Ford Island, those few PBYs that had emerged unscathed from the morning's raid were ordered into the air. Soon the big amphibians were roaring down the channel between Ford Island and Hospital Point and staggering into the sky. Getting them aloft was a dangerous prospect, because the East Lock, which served as their runway, was littered with wreckage and overlaid with a carpet of heavy sludge oil. 29-year-old Lieutenant Thomas H. Moorer, a seaplane pilot and future chairman of the Joint Chiefs, left a vivid description of what it was like to drive his aircraft down the channel, with the row of burning battleships just off his wingtips, his pontoons bucking violently over the wakes left by the boats, and oily water splashing up onto his windshield, with the result that I never did see anything until I was well clear of the island. It was a 100% instrument takeoff after we got hit with the oil. Throughout the Navy Yard and Ford Island, it was broadly assumed that a Japanese invasion was underway. Sailors deprived of their ships felt a peculiar sense of vulnerability, as they had received no training in land fighting. Defenses were hastily organized. On Ford Island, gangs of sailors were set to work digging trenches, filling sandbags, and setting up .30 and .50 caliber machine guns on tripods. Craters left by the Japanese bombs were surrounded with piles of sandbags and converted into foxholes. Rifles were handed out from the back of trucks, generally at random, including thousands of Browning automatic rifles and some thoroughly obsolete bolt-action 1903 Springfields. No one was asked to sign for the weapons they received. "Somebody handed me 2 hand grenades," said Seaman Warren G. Harding of the California. "I said, what do I do with them?" He said, seen carrying butcher's knives and meat cleavers. Navy radioman Joseph Ryan was issued a .30 caliber rifle and ammunition and told, "You guys stay right here on 1010 dock. And when the Japanese come in, get as many of them as you can before they get you." Sunday afternoon was radio prime time, when highly rated programs aired simultaneously across America on NBC and CBS network affiliates. Beginning at about 2:30 p.m., news announcers broke in over regular programming to report that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by Japanese aircraft. The scene was much the same all across the nation. Families congregated around their big cabinet-like radios and listened breathlessly to the first reports. Children who asked questions were shushed. If the radio's vacuum tubes burned out, people sat in their cars and listened to their car radios. "I had no real sense of where Hawaii was," recalled a civilian, Scott Leesburg, who heard the news from a ham radio operator in Oberlin, Ohio. "I knew it was in the Pacific." That was a very common reaction. Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Honolulu. They were not familiar names. Hawaii had been the setting for a few movies in the 1930s, and most Americans at least understood that it was a United States territory located somewhere in the Pacific. Atlases and maps were pulled off the shelves and studied carefully. For the majority of Americans who lived east of the Mississippi, Hawaii was more distant than Europe, where war had been raging for more than 2 years. But it was American soil, and it was an attack that had sunk American ships and killed American servicemen. The public had seen plenty of newsreel footage of devastated cities, both in Europe and in China. Bombs falling from the sky had seemed a distant nightmare, and further evidence that the ancient civilizations of the world were irredeemably barbaric places, from which the New World must always remain aloof. Now, with terrible suddenness, it seemed as if it could happen here. In neighborhoods all across the country, people stepped out of their homes and looked skyward, as if expecting a fleet of Japanese planes to appear suddenly overhead. Children and adolescents, with no direct memory of the Great War, tended to shrug the news off. Some assumed that the United States would simply bomb Japan back, and that Japan, having been taught a proper lesson, would refrain from any further aggression. When it was reported late Sunday afternoon that a Japanese submarine had been sunk off Oahu, 10-year-old James Erickson of Chicago rejoiced, assuming that the war was as good as won and Japan would surrender by the end of the day. 19-year-old Iris Bancroft, also of Chicago, confessed to feeling exhilarated and even elated by the coming of the war. My life to date had been relatively uneventful. So had my future, she recalled years later. Now, suddenly, I knew anything could happen. The new possibilities ahead were impossible to ignore. I felt as if I were the heroine in a romantic movie. The older generations reacted differently, especially those with sons or nephews of draft age. Pat Vang, 9 years old, heard the news over the radio in her father's grocery store. She asked her father, "Is it real bad, Daddy?" He replied, "Yes baby, very, very bad. A lot of good men will die." British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was at Chequers, his official country residence in Buckinghamshire, with 2 American House guests, John Gill Winant, the U.S. Ambassador, and Averell Harriman, the Lend-Lease coordinator. At 9 o'clock that evening, the Prime Minister turned on his portable radio for the BBC News broadcast. Only after several items on the Russian front and the British Army in Libya did the broadcaster mention a report of Japanese attacks on American and British targets in the Pacific. Churchill strode down the hall to his office and asked his staff to place a transatlantic radio telephone call to the White House. In 3 minutes the connection was successfully made, and the 2 leaders were on the phone.